Hey everybody, here's part 2 of our series about data collection. In this video, I'm going to talk about data sources and give you several options that you can choose. The key here is that you're choosing the data source that best answers your question. So there is no one right answer here. There are lots of possible data sources that you could choose. I'm going to give you some ideas of various types of data sources, and hopefully that will spark your creation in thinking about what you want to use to answer your research question. So a couple of key ideas to start off with. When we talk about data, it's important that you remember that data is considered to be plural. So when you're collecting data, when you're writing it up in your action research description, you're saying things like the data are, the data show, because you're collecting lots of bits of information, so that makes them plural. Now, a key thing to remember is that you will need multiple data sources. We use the word triangulation, so some people kind of latch on to that idea of 3, and that's actually not a bad number to keep in your head. You certainly could have more than 3 data sources. Probably you don't want to have less than 3 data sources, and here's why. Having several data sources gives your research more credibility. Your research has more rigor because you have 3 different ways of backing up what you're saying. So think of the data source as evidence that's going to back up what you're going to say to answer your question. And so the more sources you have, the more reliable your answer is. But of course, we don't want to go overboard because remember, our key word is doable. We're trying to keep this project doable. So for instance, in the e-textbook study that I talked about earlier in videos, I could have just stopped at asking my students to write in a journal about how they liked using an e-textbook. And that's one data source. But with that data source, I'm getting just a narrow view of their thoughts. Plus, they might be writing things that they think I want to hear. So I'm going to add 2 more data sources to that. I'm going to give them a questionnaire where they have to answer certain kinds of questions that they might not write about in their journal. And I'm going to interview a few of the students where I'm going to more direct the types of information that I want to gain from them. Now, when I draw conclusions from those data sources, I have 3 different ways to possibly back up what it is I'm trying to say. Also, a word about pre and post data sources. Some of your data sources might entail pre and post assessment, something you do at the beginning, then you do the intervention, then you use that data source again to find out if your intervention was effective or not. That is perfectly fine. That may work best for your question, but it might not work for your question. For instance, in my e-textbook study, I did not do pre and post questions because it didn't seem to work for my study. I was just trying to explore what their perceptions were about the e-textbook. But your study might require pre and post, so it just depends on what you're going to study. All right, let's look at some of these data sources. We're going to talk about 3: artifacts, observational data, and inquiry data. I'm going to give you lots of different options. Please make sure that you're following this idea that it really is the sources that match your question. In no way would I expect you to use all of these sources that I'm going to describe. You don't even necessarily have to have a source from each of these categories, although that might be a good goal to have, but you don't have to. I'm going to give you an example that has triangulation of data just from the artifacts category. But this is a place to begin. In the artifacts, really we're talking a lot about student-generated artifacts. It could be that you use archived artifacts, which might be assessment reports that are already at your school. These archived would be things that you wouldn't really create, things that were already generated, probably formal things. And so I'm not going to talk very much about those. You certainly can use those as a data source, I'm going to talk more about student generated, and these are the sources that you would especially use if you are trying out an intervention. So if you're testing out something, like you're trying a book club with your students and you want to see how it's working, you probably would want to use some type of student generated data. Now, the key here is that you're collecting this data from the students, but you're analyzing it in a systematic way. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you would do that with student generated data. In Canvas, I created a folder or a module for data collection. And there is a handout that has some examples of some specific things to go with student-generated artifacts. For instance, there's some journal prompts. There's some information about rubrics, which are important to use with student-generated work, so you're analyzing that data systematically. So there's additional information in that folder in Canvas. Some tips when you're gathering artifacts from students. These could be a formal assessment. You might have noticed standardized and end of the unit tests are on artifacts. You could get your data from a test that you give to students. Now, if only part of the test matches your research question, then you would only report part of the data. You would not have to report all of the test in your action research study. If you're collecting student work samples, for our project, it's fine to have students' names on these work samples. Really, you and I, and possibly the two people in your writing team, are the only ones who are going to see this work. So it's perfectly safe to collect those samples with student names as long as you have permission for the student to be involved in the study. The key here is that you collect the work sample, but you're going to analyze it in some systematic way. You're going to look at let's say you're collecting student illustrations or drawings. You're going to analyze those each in the same way by using some kind of a rubric or a checklist, so that you're trying to take out your own personal bias, which is impossible to totally remove, but some way that you're looking for the same thing in each of the student samples. If you're using a writing sample, you might use the 6-trait rubric or some other type of writing rubric to analyze student work. Each piece of work is analyzed in a similar way. So let's say that your research question is on comprehension. And here are 3 data sources you could use to triangulate the data. One could be a chapter test at the end of the unit. Another could be a self-assessment, and I'll show you a couple of examples. And a third could be a written or oral retelling. So for a self-assessment, you would be asking the students to assess themselves, which you can already see inherently there's some problems with the self-assessment, whether students are being honest. It's important that you're encouraging them to be honest, stating that I do appreciate you being honest. This is not graded. We're trying to take a look at ourselves as learners. That doesn't mean you're going to get that. So of course you wouldn't want to only use this as a source of data for a study. You'd want to confirm what you found in a self-assessment with their chapter test, or in this case with an oral or written retelling. Keep it short, keep it simple when you're asking for self-assessments. Another example of a self-assessment is more graphic, maybe for younger students. You could read each sentence to them and then have them color or circle the circle, so that then you can get some self-reflection data from students. Also, you would want to triangulate that with an oral or written retelling. And this is an example of a rubric. There are lots of other rubrics that you can find to assess an oral or written retelling. So if it's an oral retelling, you're probably going to want to make an audio recording of that or a video recording. So you can go back and look at or listen to the retelling and apply the rubric to the retelling. If it's a written retelling, then of course you would take the sample of writing and then apply the rubric to that sample. I do include in the folder in Canvas some links to places you can go to get rubrics or to create rubrics if that's something that you're not familiar with. those resources might be helpful to you. So for my triangulation, now I have my chapter test, which I didn't show you an example of, but I don't think that's really necessary. The self-assessment, I showed you two. You would only need to use one, but you could use two if you wanted to, but a self-assessment and then a retelling. So that's just one example of how you can put those three data sources together to get your triangulation. Okay, now we're moving on to observational data. So we're just talking about artifacts. Now we're talking about observing. You observing some behaviors in your students and systematically recording those. So first you have to decide what it is you're going to observe, whom to observe, and what role will you play. While you're observing, will you video or audio record it? Will you respond to students? Will you answer their questions if they get stuck? Or will you just sit back and watch? Those are all decisions that you'll have to make before you start collecting observational data. So some different ways that you can record observational data. So this is about you watching students doing something. And field notes is one tool. I'm going to talk though separately about field notes in video 3, so I'm not going to explain them now. You could keep a log, a checklist, or tally sheets. These are all informal types of tools. There's no certain way a log or a checklist or a tally sheet would have to look, no certain things that would have to be on there. You would create that based on your research question and what it is you're looking for. Just a simple example of a log is a way for you to keep track of the things that you see your students doing. And same thing with a checklist, creating a list of what you're looking for and checking it off, or a tally sheet, a list of what you're expecting to see, and then making tally marks when you see that happen. So very informal, but still systematically allows you to observe certain behaviors in students. Our third category is inquiry data. This is good if you're wanting to understand why something is happening. So it really is based on the student's knowledge, their values, beliefs, experiences, feelings, opinions, attitudes, perceptions. If you want to understand how students feel about something or why they're doing something, you might use inquiry data. Inquiry data can include interviews, and those could be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. And in the handout in the folder in Canvas, there are some sample interview questions and some tips for interviewing. Just keep in mind with interviewing, you want to be sure and let the person know up front, like with a self-assessment, that you hope they'll be honest with you, that you appreciate that honesty, that there's no penalties if they say something that they think you might not like. It's important that you actually say that aloud so that the students understand that. A structured interview is where you have set questions and you only ask those questions. You don't veer from those questions. You ask all of the people the same questions. That way you can compare responses across questions. A semi-structured interview has some of those structured questions, but then it has an open-ended question. So you may ask a question of a student, how do you feel about reading? Then a semi-structured addition to that could be, why do you think you feel that way? And maybe you ask students all of that same why question, or maybe you only ask it depending on how students answered that structured question. An unstructured interview is just really full of open-ended questions that you play off of depending on whatever the interviewee said or the student said. So if you ask that question, how do you feel about reading, and a student responds, then you may ask, is that a feeling that you got from watching your brothers and sisters? Well, you might not ask that same question to a student who doesn't have any brothers or sisters. So unstructured questions really vary depending on the student, but they really let you dig into the why. And so they do play a good role in interviewing. Oh, one other thing about interviewing, it is always helpful to make an audio recording of the interview. I don't recommend interviewing more than a small handful of students because it can be very time consuming. You could interview more than one student at the same time, although they might try to copy off of each other. But in a full-blown research study, you would take that audio recording and you would type out a transcript and you would analyze that. You may not have time to do that. You may just get to go back, kind of make some notes from listening to the interview again, but do make a recording because it's hard to remember all of the great things that you might get, the great pieces of data you might get from an interview. A questionnaire is also an inquiry tool. Questionnaire is really kind of like an interview on paper, although you don't have the option for that unstructured type of question. So encourage students to put their name on the questionnaire only if you want to compare their data. So if you want to compare their questionnaire to their interview, to their chapter test, you have to have names on there. But it may not be required if you're not making that kind of a comparison. Questionnaire questions could be open-ended or they could be closed questions. They could be yes, no, they could be multiple choice, they could be fill in the blank. Just depends on what you're trying to get at. Questionnaires could be electronic, so you could use Google Forms or SurveyMonkey are both tools that you could use to create a questionnaire, and they'll give you kind of a spreadsheet of the results, which is really handy when you go to analyze your data. So when you're creating a questionnaire, having multiple choice or yes, no, or true, false questions is a faster way to analyze, but you don't get as rich of a description as you would if you had open-ended questions. So you have to kind of decide there what's going to be best for you. Make sure your questions, though, align to your research question. Try your questionnaire out on somebody who's not in your study and see how it works. See if the wording makes sense. That's always a good thing to do ahead of time. And keep your questionnaire brief. I say no more than 10 questions in a questionnaire. Now, an attitude scale can help you get at how your students are feeling about something. There are some published attitude scales out there that you might be able to find online. I have a list of those in the handout in Canvas. There are 2 attitude scales that I've included a link for. One is a writing attitude scale, one is a reading attitude scale. Both of those use Garfield as a character. So there's a happy Garfield, a so-so Garfield, an unhappy Garfield, and that lets students who are not reading as well participate in the attitude scale. But there are other kinds of attitude scales you can find. It's nice to find one that's already published, but you could create your own attitude scale too. And with that, you would probably have words like very confident, somewhat confident, not so confident, or enjoy, sort of enjoy, don't enjoy, kind of giving that kind of range of attitudes that students can pick from. Great thing about attitude scales is you can score them easily, and then you have a lot of good data that you can use that's easy to get to. So that gives you a good overview of data sources. Hopefully you've got some ideas of some you might want to try. Be sure to check out the folder in Canvas, and I'm going on to part 3, field notes.